Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, social media, and how to support The History of the Papacy by going to the website, a2zhistorypage.com. Speaking of supporting the show, Patreon is a great way to do that. We're at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. There's 4 tiers to the History of the Papacy Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. You will be included on the History of the Papacy Diptychs, which is the greatest benefit as far as I'm concerned. You want to sign up early so that your name is higher on the lists. We are also rolling out Pope Coin with all the rise of the cryptos and all of that stuff. You want to have a coin that represents value in the history of the papacy and the Christian church. Pope Coin is a commemorative coin that I will ship to you if you become a Patreon member. Now, our members already, they're going to get their coin shortly, so that there's only a limited pool of Pope coins, and you're going to want it just like with Bitcoin or something. I don't really understand it, but you get the drift. You want to get your coin now, because when they're gone, they are gone. So go over to patreon.com/history of the papacy to get your Pope coin. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, and William H. at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, and John, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, and Alex the Great. Now, as you well know, we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, now featuring Josh Cohen's Eyewitness Histories, among many other great shows, including, but not limited to, James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. Today, we are joined yet again by our good friend Gil Kidron of a podcast of biblical proportions to talk about who Baruch Ben Neriah was as a person and a writer. Gil provides us with background on this person who was in the backseat, so to speak, with Jeremiah, but then became a big name in his own right. With that, here's the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. In the ancient world, you have the scribes, and I'm wondering if in the process, I'm not quite familiar, and it was a question that kept coming up in my mind. Is Jeremiah coming up with the content and giving it to Ben Neriah to put it together, or is Jeremiah, and just I guess in general too, of how that whole system worked? Because I've seen some things where some scribes, like I think it was Paul, don't quote me on that, but he basically dictated it to his scribe. Like I don't know if he ever put physically put quill to parchment. I think that was, and a lot of writers would do that. They would dictate word for word what they wanted their scribe to write down. But I would imagine that there was a spectrum of any number of things. If you had a really good scribe, give your scribe some talking points. This is what I want. Do your best with it. Do we have any idea of how Jeremiah would have done that with Ben Neriah?
So he also claims to have dictated everything word for word. And after all his prophecies were burned by the king, then he redictated everything word for word, just like, because Yahweh came to him again. But as luck would have it, we can compare Jeremiah with Ben Neriah and with another scribe, because after like 75% of the book, there's a very short chapter where, and this is like the widely accepted, take on this chapter. Baruch Ben Neriah approaches Jeremiah, asks him to make him a prophet. Yahweh through Jeremiah make him a prophet, and Jeremiah says, "Sorry, no, because people are dying, the world is evil, so no." and very super short chapter. And then you have Jeremiah in Egypt, and he's rambling and mumbling, if you can mumble through text, and just like incoherent and just like not no beauty whatsoever, no flow whatsoever. And I don't know, just to make sense that after that they had a falling out, and here there's someone else, and now Jeremiah is just like he's not the same Jeremiah. So just like the way that I visualize it, that he dictates everything and the scribe puts it down to text. And then if it's a scribe that this is what he wants to do, takes the text and goes over it over and over and over and just like turns it into literature and poetry. And Jeremiah, before he had Ben Neriah, he was a nobody. He was a joke. He was a joke. And then go back to what to Jeremiah chapter 36. The moment that it's put on text by this so-called nobody, Ben Neriah, like for us, we don't know who he is, then the king has to hear what this silly little prophet has to say. He didn't care what he said before, but now it's written. Just like, and you can feel like the awe that they have from these words being on text. I find it fascinating.
Baruch Ben Neriah gets his own book, and you speak a bit about that. There is a book of Baruch, and it's called the Deuterocanonical books of the Bible. The Catholics sometimes use it. The Protestants, as far as I know, don't use it. I don't think it was generally accepted. It's not accepted now in most Jewish, if any Jewish texts at all. And the Orthodox,
we don't have the Jewish. We don't have the Hebrew version.
Because I think it was the only one we have left of it now is the Septuagint version of it. And you get into that a bit in your podcast, that this was a pseudo-epigraphal writing. I pronounced that one right. That it was pseudo-epigraphal, is that it was written by somebody else later in his style. And is that generally what people think?
Yes, this is what scholars say. This is not part of the Hebrew Bible, so I know very little about those 4 books. But if you look at the list of all the people who have gotten books, you have, King Solomon, Adam, and Baruch Ben Neriah with King Solomon and Adam, and he has more books than them. And we know so many legends about him. You can just Google it and just find all kinds of Muslim legends about him, and Zoroastrian legends about him, and Jewish and Christian legends about him. So this was an important person, such an important person that he was remembered 2,000 years after he died. And that I can't see all that fame from scribing the book of Jeremiah. He never did anything that important in the book. No, I can't see it. And he was very famous in Egypt, where he went and where Joseph went after a calamity. So just I think the only thing that you can say that is very valid to undermine this idea is that why has it only come up now? And why aren't other scholars, real scholars, saying that? I have no answer for that. I don't know. This is a very good point. I don't know. I want scholars to please scrutinize everything. I did my best.
It's pretty clear that Ben Neriah was a gigantic deal. If everybody later is still quoting him and interested in him, like you said, later Jewish scholars, Christian scholars, Muslim scholars, they're interested in him. And you get it. It's interesting enough that somebody wants to write a book later in his style. If he wasn't a big deal, presumably they would have written it as a pseudo-epigraphal of Jeremiah, not Ben Neriah.
Right. I didn't think about that. It doesn't seem that they liked Jeremiah very much. I wouldn't have liked him. He just went around in Egypt when they were, after they immigrated, and just harassed them about how they're living their lives and who they're praying for. And he was gloating that the people of the Levant were also being killed by Nebuchadnezzar. And just a very, very spiteful and toxic person. And I think also mentally ill. And thanks to Baruch Ben Neriah, we still know who he is today. And some of his horrible rants are inside the holy book. So that's something that Ben Neriah, has to answer for, I think.
And now a word from our sponsors. As far as the scholarship goes, where does it stand, this idea? Is there any writers in either in Hebrew or in English that you've seen who are kind of looking more at Ben Neriah?
No, nobody that I could find. But it's good that you asked, because it reminded me that I mentioned earlier Professor Gil Kidron, the rogue scholar. So he's been banging his head against the wall. I'm not in academia. I don't know how things, go in the halls of academia. He does. He might be, a character, whatever. But his experience is that nobody's listening to him, even though he has a very good case about who wrote Deuteronomy. And there are about 100 times more evidence that Ben Neriah wrote Genesis. So I think both of them work. And nobody's taking him seriously. Nobody in academia has picked up, the mantle, started to look into it, to even think about it as a possibility. He says that they have like groupthink, and it's a very they have a conservative viewpoint of how to approach it. And also, just by listening recently to a lot of interviews with historians of the ancient world and archaeologists, they also say the same. You have like cliques, and you have to be in that camp or that camp, and you take no risks. So maybe you just need a podcaster with nothing to lose, who just like okay, I might be an idiot. But please prove me wrong. I don't mind being wrong at all. I don't mind. But you have to work very, very hard to prove it, because I worked really, really hard on it. So it has you have to come up with a better story.
Your idea is that with your podcast is you're working through from Genesis to Exodus to Leviticus in the canonical way. Have you thought about it? I was thinking of this when I listened to your episodes on this. Have you ever thought about maybe jumping ahead to Jeremiah? Because you had mentioned something that in 20 years or whatever, when you finally get to Jeremiah, does it make sense to start looking at these books in different ways and not necessarily the way they're listed out canonically?
This is a very good point. So recently, tell me what you think about it, honestly. So what I was thinking, now I got Jeremiah into Genesis, right? So we already know about Jeremiah, whatever, if you listen to the podcast and you find that interesting. So now you're up to date. So I was thinking now with Exodus, not do it the same way that I did before, because now I know what I'm looking for and I know what I'm reading. So I want to, as I'm telling the story that they're telling of the time, the ancient time, so-called ancient time that they're portraying in Egypt, because now Egypt, before in Genesis, Egypt is the safe haven. Now immediately it's like the hell. And try to get into the minds of the people who wrote it, now that I kind of have an idea of who they might be, because these scribes appear in the book, and try to place them in time when could they have written it, and then you would just automatically jump ahead in order to tell this story better. Because you can't tell the story of Genesis to its fullest extent if you don't know the story of Jeremiah. Because if you don't know the story of Jeremiah, Baruch Ben Neriah, then it's it's something else. So I think the same is Exodus. And if I just like follow what scholars say, but just like take a few more steps ahead, and they do say that the exile in Babylon, there are Hebrews in Egypt, prosperous. They just don't say who are they. But it says in the book of Jeremiah how like that a lot of them, like the whole community, went down to Egypt. And it says in Genesis that they went down to Egypt. So it's just like connecting two dots that I didn't put there on the board. I just like drew a line. And if you go a little bit further and they say, okay, so these were the rival factions, the one that was in Egypt, the one that was in Babylon, because the ones that are getting exiled are the ones who were causing the problems. And Jeremiah, the moment the Babylonians come in, they go to the jail, they know who he is, they're looking for him to liberate him, to free him, and to give him property and money. I don't know, it kind of seems like he was, working for them, like they knew who he was. And he didn't want to go with Hebrews exiled to Babylon because they hated him. And they thought he was a Babylonian spy. So just like connecting all the things that we read from the text, what the scholars are saying, to me, it breaks the Bible apart, the Hebrew Bible apart into two sets. The Hebrews in Egypt and the Hebrews in Babylon. And the Hebrews in Babylon are the more conservative, hawkish, fundamentalist, just harsh and grave. Just like if you remember Exodus, like God there bullies Moses into compliance, and he changes the Pharaoh's mind in order to make him take back his promise to let them go. So God kills his all the firstborn. So this is the God that the people of Exodus, that they are portraying. A malicious God, a cruel God, very strong God. This is not the same God from Genesis. It's just not in terms of how the deity is portrayed. He does kill some people, but he cuts a deal with his peeps, and he negotiates and renegotiates, and he feels like he has to answer to them as well. It's not a one-way street. Doesn't force anybody to do anything. He's understanding. So I don't know. Just like why should we just accept it that it's the same just because the books are one after the other? I think this also it says a lot about how, for lack of a better word, propaganda, I don't know, miseducation, how it prevents us from reading what's right in front of our eyes for Hebrew speakers. Okay, you can't blame the non-Hebrew speakers for not realizing it. But just like you read the text, this is in the text. Just because we've been told that Yahweh and Elohim is the same thing, so just like our brain, just like you have to really unlearn and train yourself in order to be able to just like get into the mind of the way that it was written and meant to be consumed, because this is important. It wasn't written for us. Baruch Ben Neriah, he doesn't know anything about the internet and podcast.
Are you saying that the Babylonian Hebrews wrote about what was going on in Egypt? Is that?
First of all, it makes sense that the people in Egypt, under the protection of the Pharaoh, would.
Yeah, why are they going to bash Pharaoh?
Yeah, this is something that we know of history, right? People who write good things to the king that they want to ingratiate them onto. So they did have the story of Exodus before they wrote the story of Exodus. It existed because it's all throughout the Bible. I have this feeling that as they're stewing in Babylon about what had happened, that they're hating on their brothers down there in Egypt being so happy and so prosperous and so free in their minds, they're just like making Egypt so much worse. Being in Babylon, saying, "Oh no, Egypt is the worst. It's just the worst. It's the worst." I'm really looking forward to starting. I have to take a break a little bit before I restart with Exodus, but I'm really looking forward to see if this initial idea that I have now, if it holds as I start, to really pour into it.
It makes a ton of sense to me, because you're going to say that in Egypt, there must have been a huge Hebrew population there, because later on we learn that Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, had two Jewish quarters in it. So it always blows my mind that Alexandria is so awesome. It has to have 5 quarters. But so of the 5 quarters of Egypt, of Alexandria, almost half of the city is Jewish. You could probably extrapolate a good percentage, and that probably translated pretty much throughout the whole area, that there's a ton of Hebrew.
Where did they come from?
Yeah, where did they come from? What do they think? They're quite different than the Jewish people, Hebrew people who are still living in Israel or Palestine or whatever. The names are all depending on the time period.
You triggered me.
Versus the people who are living in Babylon, obviously they're all going to have very different ideas about things. And we see that even in the text, that when a lot of the Babylonian exiles come back, they're like, well, who are these country bumpkins still living here? And then the next part of the puzzle that I didn't really think about is that if you still have a ton of Hebrew people living in Egypt, they have a very different perspective on what's going on back home and what's going on with these people who went to Babylon. That's a huge area for conflict, for different viewpoints on what's going on and what's going on with these texts that they have.
And the book of Exodus, for example, half of it is the Exodus, and the second half is just like a detailed explanation of the shrine, of the temple, how it should be built. Just like, just everything, the decorations and every little thing. And and we know from scholarship that the Hebrews in Babylon, they were obsessed about the temple in Jerusalem that was just destroyed. It was their temple.
Yes.
In Genesis, they don't care about the temple. And also we know from scholarship, because, I wanted to make sure that I'm not hallucinating. So I'm like, what do scholars know about the Hebrew population in Egypt? And just as like so happens that we have hundreds of letters of Hebrews in Egypt from the Pharaonic times and from Hellenistic times. And they don't talk about Jerusalem. They have their own temple, so they're not dreaming of going back, or they're not even constructing anything remotely like that. They have their own temples for all kinds of gods, which also fits the book of Genesis and Joseph with the gods. Elohim there is very, very prominent, and you can get the sense if you lean into it that it's a general plural deity there. It really feels that is general because he's also communicating with Egyptian deities. So just like everything that we know, just like fits. I don't know. It just makes sense.
And now a word from our sponsors. The first time that I really read Exodus, as Gary Stevens and I, our mutual friend, we did an episode together, and I was familiar enough with what you might call the good parts of Exodus, Moses, and going back to the 40 years in the desert and all that stuff. That's, like you said, I think probably saying half of the book is generous. It's maybe a third of it. And then Gary and I had called it, it's like reading the book of rules on how to build a house, and the code book, the town or the city code of, the plumbing's got to be this way, or the curtains in the temple has to be this many cubits, and you have to do a grain offering this way. For a lack of a better word, it's boring. And
think about those people, who those people were.
Yeah. So if the people who are in Egypt, if they have their own temple and they're just not so concerned about that,
they have many temples. They don't have one temple. They have many temples.
Yeah.
So that's not them, and none of their temples look like that. So why should we just attribute them this kind of temple? And they're not boring, and they're not boring. Let's find the boring people. Who are the boring people who produce a boring text? I don't know. I feel like that's, I'm joking a little bit, but that's a good lead. Like, I like just like, generate leads in like what sense do you get from this story? If it's like a suspense story, if it's a comedic story, because you also have comedy in Joseph and in other parts of the Bible. And Exodus is much darker than Genesis.
Then you have the book of Joshua, which, the whole story of Joshua. There's all the battles and the killing and the battle of the 5 kingdoms. Like, that's an interesting read. But then a big chunk of that is the tribe of Reuben has this part next to this river. It reads like, if anybody's looked at their abstract from when their house was, when the person came to survey their house, and it's 0.3333 section, this, and that. It's not very exciting. And you can tell from reading it, you don't have to be a scholar of the Bible to see that there's definitely something else going on there. The reason why they would have such detailed mapping of each of these tribes sectioning of the country after that you've had all these amazing battle scenes. And I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with Joshua because there is so much killing in there, and there's it's a war genocidal story, you might say, even.
But, yeah, it's a war story, and he's a war hero, a warlord. He's not supposed to be good. A lot of peoples have war heroes who killed a lot of other people. It's an ancient story. I don't think we should look at it, judge it like Achilles. Do we judge Achilles for being violent? No.
And we should. And I think that when we look at it, and that's what I'm fascinated when you look at it, is why did they write it in that way? Why did they write a war story like that and then attach on a survey of a land survey document onto a war story genre? That's really interesting. And I think those are the questions that people should ask when they're reading these texts, is why literarily do we put these things together? And I think that's whether you're looking at it from a historical viewpoint, a theological viewpoint, or all of them together. Those are really interesting questions.
Yes, and I think already there are some leads. Again, just like by extending this point of view of two opposing traditions, one more chill, one more anxious and stressed out and aggressive, and follow the symbolism in the story. So we know from the book of Joseph that Ephraim is the most prominent tribe in Egypt. Guess who was a war hero for Ephraim? Joshua. He's their war hero. So this is why their story is in the book. Their war hero, they put him in the book because they were, paying a scribe to write it down. They would say, okay, write these stories. They didn't know that he was going to be connected later to Moses and be Moses's second in command. No, this wasn't part of the timeline that we know now. This was just like the book of Judges, famous local war heroes, stories put to text. Simple as that. Later, you add the different tribes because it's political. You have the different families that are doing the Game of Thrones stuff. Okay, we want our guy to be better, so he's going to do this, and then their guy is going to be worse, so he's going to do that, and then a later writer would switch things up. And once you just ignore all the clutter and you just look at the narrative, then all of these stories are just like famous, like just like epic stories. Like I forgot his, I'm blanking on his name. The Beowulf.
Yeah,
this is like an ancient Beowulf. We're not supposed to be happy with Beowulf killing people, but in the ancient Near East, every people had a story about somebody killing a lot of other people.
Well, and that's how you got your cred back then. They say that's if your people didn't conquer somebody else, then you're nobodies. I also I think that I can see why people call the Bible the good book. It's a good book. It's a really good piece of literature. And how many pieces of literature of a people do you get that have so many genres packed into it over such a time period, that have different writers and different writers writing on different writers, writing and rewriting different earlier pieces, and then taking these early foundations of a people and rewriting it in a new era that is a different spin on things than maybe what they originally were, what the original oral tradition was. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. And I think if you look at it, especially if you're looking at, you have the Hebrew Bible and then the New Testament, the New Testament was written in a pretty specific time, and it was edited together to in a much different way over a much shorter time. So they were able to edit together a more cohesive.
Do we know the scribes?
Pardon?
The names? Do we know the names of the scribes?
Of the new or
the new one?
Well, that opens up a can of worms. I mean, if we look at the Gospels, you can pretty much say that the people who were attributed to them, there's a good chance that they were probably the ones who wrote Luke, Matthew, John.
Like they had scribes, but their scribes do not appear in the Gospels themselves.
No, I don't think that they ever mentioned who. Again, I am not as up on my Paul as I should be, but I think he mentions who he works with in there, but I can't pull out a specific name or a specific. There's some mention of scribes, and I have not dived deep enough, but that's an interesting thing to maybe Gary is probably knows much more about that than I would.
The Quran, I want to know about the Quran. If we know some of the famous writers and scribes at that time, who would write those stories about very, very talented and accomplished writers? These are the people who would write these stories.
I think that the Quran is really interesting too, because the way they organize it, that they go from the shortest, is it the shortest to the longest sections or the longest to the shortest, whichever. And some people are, why would you put it together that way? Why don't you organize it thematically or organize it by timeline? But that was a way that that was a historical way to organize a writing. And there's no reason why you couldn't do it that way. Put the shortest bits together, then put the longer bits together and organize it that way. And that's another really fascinating way that we have our idea. I'll even just speak for English writing styles, that we write in a very specific style, but people from China and other cultures, they write in completely different styles. You don't write your essay that you have a beginning where you lay out your claim, you have evidence, and then you have a conclusion. That's culturally speaking, that's very much the way that we, meaning in the Anglosphere, that's the way we do it. But that's not how other people do it necessarily.
This is interesting because Hebrew, and also the biblical Hebrew, we have to remember this is a language, a very old language, 2,500 years ago. And we are very lucky because of some flukes in history that there are millions of people who speak that language as their first language. And it's extremely close to the ancient biblical Hebrew because it was frozen in time for more than 2,000 years. It's insane. So the qualities of Hebrew writing is its succinctness and how few words express a lot of emotions, and the simplicity is just beautiful. And the English literature is the opposite. I read most of my books, be it literature or research, obviously in English. I love reading English. I love English. Its power, literary power, is how it flows around and around and around, like Shakespeare. It doesn't go straight to the point.
Yeah.
So when I translate a Hebrew text into an English text, you add 30-40% more words.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you subtract that when you go to Hebrew. So just like, how would anyone look, like, if you do, you need to be an author and a poet that is just as fluent in Hebrew and in English, and to have the soul of an author in order to translate it as literature. I don't know if you can really do it because, again, this is such a different language with contrasting qualities.